Hello, everyone. I'm joined with Hank, aka Philologism, if that's how it's pronounced. I'll try my best here. Everyone can call him Hank. He's a big time memegram and a former theorygram fanatic. And he's writing a new book. It's called Dogs in the Weeds. What's the subtitle? I haven't written it down. Dogs
It
in the Weeds.
was it was novel of war. I'm going to change it to prose poem of war just
Mhm.
because of the style.
hmm
So,
So you're interested in prose, but also poetry.
mhm.
I've definitely read a lot more prose than poetry. Is that the case with you as well? Are you more into poetry than prose?
I've always been more into poetry, but obviously I've read more prose just because there's so much more
hmm
so much more to digest. I think with prose, so
hmm
I
I
think good prose helps poetry, if anything.
hmm I skimmed through your essay on power, I believe is what it's called,
Yes, yeah,
and
there was something I put on my list. Yeah,
yeah, and there's a passage in there I really liked. Um, I'm quoting now, and yet again I say that violence is the participation of the Almighty, and just as the stones of the oppressors began Saint Stephen's ascent towards the Almighty and open up his eyes to the divine light, so also did Christ open for himself a way into the seat of power within the Roman throne by none other than the violence of his servant Saint Constantine. And you also mentioned Saint Joan of Arc, Charlemagne, and the other saints and kings and
yeah.
authorities who seem to be acting very violently with the sanction of God. So you have lots of complicated ideas about violence and war and theology, and it's pretty interesting. I read your short little poem, the Faustian hymn,
Oh yeah.
and I got strong, T.S. Eliot vibes from that one.
Thank
So
you.
so you're in,
That means a lot. Thank you.
yeah,
Thank
and you start that essay on power with T.S. Eliot explicitly, The Wasteland. So
you. Yeah.
um, you can easily move through the ancient world to the medieval world up into the modern world, weave a
Yeah.
narrative through time. And as someone who loves history, it's really exciting and fun to read.
Thank you. I'm glad that you like
Yeah.
it. First of
Yeah.
all, I'm just really impressed that you read that. I'm very thankful for your words. I'm
Well,
very flattered. No, I will say that I wrote that the on power thing I did write when I was much more into Hegel, if that makes sense. I'm sure you can see that right away now that I've said that. It was at a time where I was really struggling, I think, with history and particularly God's history as how he leads his church. So this is immediately stepping into a big theological heap here, but I think the problem that I was going through, and I remember I spoke to my cousin about this. My cousin, he's much older than me. He's a pastor in Scotland right now. He was before, and then he was in the States for a while. Now he's back in Scotland. My whole family's from the States. But anyways, I remember talking to him about this. I was going through kind of the problem of how you get from the early church, very small, very persecuted, to the idea of the nation state and being a Christian nation state. And does that work? And at the time, I think I considered myself more supportive of the idea of a Christian nation state, right?
mhm.
As cringy as that sounds, like a lot of, I think that just being an American and having this idea about, one nation under God, you do tend to, I think because of the formula of American patriotism, it's hard to be an American patriot and not immediately think that that must mean I have to be somehow a nationalist, or what's popular nowadays. I know the term is Christian nationalist. And there's a lot of folks who are big fans of that. Probably more fans, I think, than there are opposers, just because it's such a small, Christian politics is such a small world, unless there's a few guys who are pretty liberal. I say liberal, not liberal, that's the word. Left-leaning Christians who are very good Christians who are left-leaning, who will actually argue against that. It's very hard to find that. It's more in academic circles, but a lot of detail there. Anyways, I think that at the time I was trying to more so mold for myself an explanation for myself of how can I justify what I believe right now with this. And so there was a lot of talk about things that were kind of dialectical without me having really looked into it yet, because this was before I really dug deep into Hegel. And I will say what kind of fixed my ideas about that, what kind of set me right, was moving away from Hegel, who I think a lot of us forget was a liberal theology, like that was the deep seated, he's the, what's the word? Enlightenment of enlightenment, right? That is the liberalism of liberalism, I think, is that 17 to 1800s sort of circle there, him. And I don't know if you've heard Schleiermacher, huge figurehead for liberal theology from the 1700s as well. He was a pietist who sort of tried to make things a lot more palatable for for enlightened Germans at the time. And there's also another tidbit of history. Schleiermacher, super liberal, Hegel, super liberal, did not like each other at all. Hegel detested working with Schleiermacher because Schleiermacher was so popular. But anyways, Hegel had a lot to say about why his ideal nation state, which he happened to be paid by, the Prussian state, he had to have a lot of reasons for why they were what they did. And I think that's why my kind of my accidentally sounded very Hegelian.
Mm-hmm. The Prussian state, that was the very first secular Protestant state.
Mm-hmm.
I explored that a little bit in my latest the latest installment of my own little podcast. This reminds me of Albert of Prussia. So he was at the head of the Teutonic state, the Catholic German state. The Polish king, Sigismund I, he gave Albert of Prussia the fiefdom of the Duchy of Prussia, part of his kingdom. In exchange, he became the Duke of Prussia and a Protestant. So Hegel, by extension, is a product of the Reformation. You could lump his theology in with the Reformation. And
yes, no, a lot of folks don't realize that. That's cool. You already caught on to that before I did. But no, a lot of folks don't realize just how ingrained his enlightenment is with principles. I think of his theory about humans, or what do you call anthropology? His anthropology is entirely based on the idea of what man looks like after the fall, so to speak, and what it is for man to be what Hegel terms a void. This is an interesting aside. Hegel views mankind as this void, this sort of consuming thing. Everywhere man goes, just sliding around a little bit. Everywhere man goes, he has to consume whatever's in front of him in order to become a part of that, or to kind of complete himself. His master-slave dialectic really begins with the idea that mankind walking around after the fall is a negative that needs a positive in order to balance himself out. And so, but it doesn't get balanced out because there's the negativity of one person versus the negativity of another person, that desire to be positively recognized, right? And so one person's going to win out over the other. I'm probably complicating things a little bit more, but in a way but he does start, just trust me when I say he starts with this very Christian idea of what man looks like from the bare bones, and how society begins out of that. And so he has a lot of explanations for things that a lot of Christians and reformers would probably just say, oh, it's just human nature is bad. But I think he does a lot of work going into it and saying, well, you start out with mankind being sort of this, negated, very, hollow thing, where you have this sort of, you have this face and everything, you have this sort of this outward mask, but deep inside, there's always a desire to become whatever that environment is around you. His study of religion really focuses on that, how the surrounding gets enveloped into the person where they're at, whether that surrounding is the political environment, physical environment, the environment of people around them, family, things like that, how that's enveloped into that identity. And so that continues with him, his explanation for early society all the way up to the nation state that he lives under. But yes, very reformed, very Christian point of view.
And what jumps out to me with Hegel's theology also is, the extreme individualism that he believes he alone can understand, essence, into like the individual divine essence as an individual. So
yes,
yeah.
Encyclopedic knowledge, yes.
Yes. But I want to bring it back to a different political theological concept while we're on the topic. You mentioned the Christian nation state,
yes,
which is kind of a more developed, it's like a modern version of the Katechon. The Katechon, are you familiar with that?
No.
It's a Greek term, Katechon, and it was basically, in a nutshell, it was the medieval theological understanding of the purpose of the state. The medieval state was the Katechon, which was, I think it literally means restraining. So it existed.
Yeah.
So the whole point then of a Christian state would be to restrain and withhold the apocalypse. And
interesting.
And I'm sure there are fragments of that idea within Christian nationalism today, right?
Oh yeah. No, definitely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is very interesting. I just looked that up. You're right. It said that Wikipedia said that which withholds. So yeah, that retainment, that kind of hold things back sort of thing. No, I would say that anything political, if you want to go into maybe a lot of religion is like this, but with the Christian religion, whenever it mixes with politics, is going to have a whole, like the person's opinion on that is going to have a whole lot to do with their eschatology. So that is very interesting, that word and that history. I'll have to look in more into that medieval aspect. I love medieval thinking is so much more diverse and widespread and influential than I'll probably ever be able to wrap my head around. But the more every time I ever dip my toe into that kind of stuff, it's always a very fascinating journey. It's always the beginning of some very interesting revelation about where Western philosophy and Western theology has really like traversed a lot of terrain. A lot of terrain to cover. That's good. That's cool stuff.
Yeah, agree 100%. So if you can find Hank's work on hankrosen.onuniverse.com. I think that's where you're based out of right now. And I want to talk a bit about poetry, and in particular the difference between ancient and modern poetry as we understand it, as we also understand manliness. So you mentioned Achilles in your essay, so we have to talk about Homer and the role.
Was it Brad Pitt who was Achilles? I can't remember now.
I'm not in that part of Instagram, the Achilles posters.
Oh no, I mean Troy. Did you ever see Troy?
Yeah, I've seen it.
It's such a fun movie. I love that.
Yeah. But
we can.
So right. I'm gonna throw it back a bit to Plato in book 1. Socrates is Plato's Republic, book 1. Socrates is talking to Cephalus, and PG-13 warning. Socrates asks Cephalus how he's doing with women, because Cephalus has grown old, and Cephalus recounts the words of a different poet. He calls him a poet. That's Sophocles. So hopefully we have all the names straight, all of the ancient Greek names. So Cephalus is recounting Sophocles, and he says, once I was present when the poet Sophocles was asked by someone, "How are you in sex? Can you still have intercourse with a woman?" "Silence, man," said Sophocles. "Most joyfully did I escape it, as though I had run away from a sort of frenzied and savage master." So
how fascinating.
So the ancient Greek poet is taking the misogyny pill, right?
Yeah.
And This is, I think this is remarkable because poetry in the ancient world is associated with manliness and heroicness in the style of Achilles, right? And Homer.
Mm-hmm.
And then philosophy, on the other hand, was seen as feminine.
Mm.
Whereas today, now it's kind of the opposite. Philosophy is just a bunch of old dead men,
Yeah.
and poetry is where you can really express yourself. And it's, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's not as
Well,
elite. Yeah. So,
if
what are your
I may,
thoughts on that?
if I may, I would say that probably the reason that things have flipped, maybe not for poetry, but at least for philosophy, I will say perhaps the reason it's flipped is because of kind of this sort of I don't know what to call it, but this sort of self-portraiture, you might say, of philosophy, where we consider more the philosopher themselves than what they were doing. And I would say probably if we went back even just the last 50 years to Camus or Deleuze or maybe even Sartre,
Mm-hmm.
of course, all French people, I think if you asked them, they would have considered philosophy to still be a very womanly thing or a womanly, apparition or, visage or however you want to call that. But I think that if they were the ones you were asking, they would say, like obviously, philosophy is a woman or something like that. Or they would say that because philosophia, I believe it's the same in French, philosophia, it's a feminine word. I would believe that they would consider it to be more of a female thing that they're contemplating, right? But I think that we in America, especially, but in just this postmodern age where you consider things more by their appearance, but almost like the appearance of the appearance, we just really think of the portraits of the old men. I think that we usually just tend to think of philosophy, therefore, as a masculine subject because men are the ones who seem to be doing most of it for the past 2,000 years. But I would say that the subject itself is still a very feminine subject. I think if you're talking about this Greek thing, this idea, the idea of philosophy, and I mean, think about, moving from philosophy to religion for a second. Wisdom in the Old Testament is a woman who's it's in the Psalms, I believe, where it talks about how wisdom cries out in the streets and she is calling out to people, asking people to listen to her. And so the spirit of wisdom is a feminine spirit in the Jewish tradition as well as in the Greek tradition. And I think that it's mostly the very problematic culture that we live in that makes us look back and say, oh, old dead men or, long gone men went into this more often than anyone else. Therefore, it must be a masculine subject because we live in the age of the man cave. I think that's kind of an unfortunate thing, but I would say that's why it seems to a lot of folks that it's switched. Does that make sense?
What made the most sense to me was man cave, and I'm sure you meant
Yeah.
cave in the platonic sense, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, we're deep in the man cave now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's funny. No, you're
Mhm.
right. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I would agree completely.
Mhm.
Um, there has been a definite flip, but I would say that um, it is unfortunate though, at least for poetry, that there aren't as many men who are interested in it because I think it is such a wonderful outlet. I think that discovering poetry for me was discovering something that was palatable, both as a consume to consume, to read it and like discovering Eliot. Actually, it was my father-in-law who introduced me to Eliot, and he told me about Ash Wednesday, the poem. He told me about it maybe 3 years ago on Ash Wednesday. He told me about it. He's like, yeah, this is a good poem by this guy T.S. Eliot. You should look into it. And so I looked into his other stuff because I really appreciated just that it was a very pretty style. I liked it. I like reading things that are aesthetically pleasing. So that drew me to it initially. But realizing just how simple it is to go put your own words on paper. You don't have to share it with anybody, you don't have to be doing it for an audience, and doing it for yourself, I think gives you a wonderful outlet. And I wish that there were more young men who were interested in that and realized what a great place it is to kind of reflect and to kind of look back, like not necessarily as a journal thing, right? But just to kind of like read it and then right away read what you're writing and then use that as kind of almost an analytical tool to kind of see where you're at um, in the kind of subjects that you're interested in and stuff like that. It doesn't have to be about any particularly feminine thing or particularly masculine thing. You don't have to write poetry about uh, warfare for you to be, for you to be contemplating on a masculine thing. You don't have to, and all poetry doesn't have to be about love for it to be very deep and meaningful. I'd say that a lot of the most important poems I've ever read were much more about uh, teenage angst. T.S. Eliot, about not teenage angst maybe, but like the angst of being young, the angst of growing old. Um, just the general anxiety of life, I think, is a much more interesting subject, anyways. So I do wish more young men would explore that, especially the modern period between maybe 1910-ish and like 1935 or so. You have so much important poetry being written that I think is always going to be very palatable, always going to be very available for people to get into, become interested, find that sort of aesthetic beauty in it, and then kind of look for the meaning further and further. Because you can enjoy something without having to go into all the elements that make it important. I think the most important thing is that you appreciate it, and then it makes you either want to read more or want to write some of it yourself, and let that be a place where you can kind of get all of your problems and put them out there in a place where you can control it. Because I think that that's obviously for young men nowadays, that's a huge problem, I would say, is being able to have things in a controlled environment where you can kind of let things be crazy for a second, Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned your grandfather, right? It was him who introduced you to your
It was
first,
my,
yeah.
it was my father-in-law.
Oh, your father-in-law. Okay.
Yes.
And do you know how he was introduced to Elliot?
No, I don't know. He was a Reformed pastor for
Mhm.
a while. He was a Presbyterian pastor for a good while, and he just knows. So I've learned more about philosophy and theology from him than from anyone else I'd ever be able to learn from. Uh, he's just a very deeply well-read man, and he has so much experience behind what he's learned. And so I can talk to him about anything, and if I have a philosophical question for him, I've asked him before in the past, and he'll have several very niche places to go to, niche authors and writings to go to help me answer it myself, which is more important, I think, than having, because I think that it's so hard to find folks who are older who aren't going to just like give you an answer that they think that you need, or an answer that they find interesting. And I think that's hard to find folks who are really have that sage wisdom, who are going to show you where to find the answer yourself, because they know it's going to be different a little bit for you than it was for them. So he's a very important person in my life. But yeah, thank you for asking about him.
Well, my advice is to just listen to whatever Jordan Peterson says. Yeah, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I agree 100%. You mentioned you mentioned you mentioned your father-in-law would send you obscure authors and take you down the rabbit hole. Are you familiar with Samuel Taylor Coleridge?
Oh yes.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Have you read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner?
Yes, I'll do you one better. Go on YouTube and you can find the guy who plays the guy in the Lord of the Rings who plays the old wizard.
Uh, his
Name
name
right
escapes me
now.
too. Yeah.
Yes, but if you look up first look up Gandalf Lord of the Rings cast, and then when you find that guy, look that up, and then Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. He actually has an out loud read version of it.
Ooh.
That's very good. But yes, no, I love Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. I think he has the most pleasant English traditional poetry that you can find. That's still very, at the time he wrote it in an older style, but it's just still so pleasant to listen to. And it actually has the rhyming and the meter that you expect, I think, from more traditional modern English poetry. I mean, modern is 1500s over, modern English poetry that you can find. I absolutely love his work.
I looked it up. It's Ian McKellen.
Yes, Ian McKellen. Yes, if you look up Ian McKellen, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's about half an hour. Don't speed it up. Listen to it. It's a wonderful piece.
This is a good tangent here. Now, of course, we all love the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. Oh. And we start to get off in the weeds a little bit with The Hobbit, right? The Hobbit trilogy. I remember Ian McKellen at some point when he was on set filming The Hobbit, he broke down and was really distraught because he was just in a green screen room acting to like a tennis ball. It was all CGI, so he was totally shocked and had no. So that only begs more questions about this new Amazon Lord of the Rings
Oh yeah, no,
thing
I heard
coming down
about.
the tube. Yeah.
No, I kind of hope the best for it. My
Mhm.
thing, actors, newer actors, younger producers, younger directors getting involved. I love that. I
Mhm.
want people to be exploring these stories. And from what I understand, it's about more obscure literature. It's like
The
the
Cimmerillion, I
yes, the
think.
summer. I've heard
Yeah.
about that since I was in middle school. I know. I'll be honest. I only read the first Lord of
Mhm.
the Rings book, and I can't do encyclopedia entries. That's kind of I think the sci-fi fantasy word for his kind of writing is the encyclopedia entry.
Mhm.
And as much as I appreciate him for bringing that genre into existence, I'm not a fan of the fantasy genre either. I can't say, but I will say I appreciate the work and the relationship that J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis had. I think is a very interesting thing that really affected not just fantasy but sci-fi as well. If you've ever read Lewis's sci-fi works, they're actually very interesting. But anyways, I'm getting off on a tangent here. Give me a second to rewind here. Talking about the Amazon production, I would say that it's always a good thing to see that folks are getting more involved in it and that younger people are getting an opportunity. I would also say that as far as the green screen room thing, hopefully they change the trajectory, because I will tell you this: I've been watching a lot of more or less classic um, films lately. I watched this week. Uh, it's Tennessee Williams. Give me a second. It's Marlon Brando's big one. I'm gonna remember it in a second. But I was also watching. Well, I'm trying to remember that. I was also watching uh, Rebel Without a Cause, and give me another moment. East of Eden, really good. They both have the same actor, and I'm gonna remember what his name is in a second. He was James Dean. Can't
Mhm.
remember anything to say in my life right now. James Dean was in both of those. There's a lot of really great on-scene um, production. It's a lot of, of course, everything back then is on location. The Marlon Brando one, Streetcar Named Desire, another wonderful, wonderful '60s flick. But I will say that the art kind of speaks for itself when you have that on location
Yeah.
cinematography. And I really hope that the new Lord of the Rings tries to go back to that, with those New Zealand shots, or Australia, wherever they filmed the first three. I think it was New Zealand. Um, I think that spoke for most of the background. I think that gives the film more voice than people realize until you go back and you look at the difference between the early 2000s trilogy and the late 2010s trilogy of The Hobbit. That's going to be, I think, what feeds more of the interest for me, at least, is the cinematic experience, because I think it's so amazing that you can forget that the whole point of film is the cinematography, you know. And I think that's a whole interesting thing actually with media history. um, when you look back at the history of broadcasting, when TV was first a thing, they called it, when the TV shows were first coming out in the 50s, they called it radio with pictures, because there was hardly any difference between the stories of the radio and the stories on TV shows, because you only could have like 2 or 3 different scenes, because you had only the set itself that you had to film live. And it wasn't until people started treating TV shows more like cinematography when you started to get really in-depth stories and more interesting scenarios. And so with this being a TV show, I hope they don't forget that it has to be more cinematography involved for it to be more interesting.
I feel a great Marshall McLuhan tangent right there. We
Yes,
can we can
somewhere.
go. I don't know that much about him,
Yeah.
so I would like it if you could take that one. But first,
Mhm.
um, you mentioned you're watching old films.
Mm.
Have you seen The Manchurian Candidate,
No, I
1962?
haven't. Maybe we can
Okay,
save that for another one. I don't want to kill screen time.
yeah, yeah,
I'll have to watch that one too. Then I've heard a lot. My mom talks about. She
yeah.
loves films like
Um, I'll go off on a little tangent. It's great
that.
because once you know the background of like a little bit about MK Ultra and what was going on in the 50s and the 60s,
Mhm.
That movie takes on a completely different meaning because
Mm.
how familiar are you with that rabbit hole?
I've heard a little bit about it,
Okay,
but
so
that makes me more excited to watch that film.
I'll set it up in case anyone wants to watch it. So um, the basic plot is these POWs are moving through Manchuria, and I think it's during the Korean War. And as they're traveling through, they start to have memory loss, and they arrive in the US and they are all pretty confused. They don't exactly know what happened while they were traveling. And then it starts to be revealed that they were brainwashed by the Chinese. Um, they set
What?
they set up one of the prisoners to assassinate the president. They
Okay.
created a hypnotic assassin. Um, so Frank Sinatra's in this movie. He plays, the good cop, and he has to foil this assassination plot that the Chinese did by brainwashing these prisoners. Well, what, 12 years later, 13 years later, the MK Ultra is exposed that they were actually trying to create some kind of Manchurian candidate, tried to create some kind of hypnotic assassin that could actually kill a politician and not remember doing it. So you
Gosh.
can you can see the timeline here. These ideas are being tossed around in small circles, and
Mm.
I mean, and of course, Frank Sinatra was pretty close with JFK at some point throughout his career. So there's a huge rabbit hole there, and I love that. So that's where I do well. So
I love
the
conspiracy theories, man. I could
yeah.
talk about them for.
Hmm.
It's hard to escape that rabbit hole
Yeah.
by going down it.
So you mentioned McLuhan.
Yes.
I don't know anything about him. Where do I start with McLuhan?
I haven't read his work, so I'll disclaim that. I will say
Mhm.
I've studied in school a little bit because
Oh.
I did take a media class that had to do with his ideas about different media and how media changes. And it was interesting because it was all about modern, as in within the last 20 years broadcasting. So really, it was mostly a class about here's how news was in the 90s, and this is why now we get it from Twitter. So that was
Mhm.
like most of the class. You could say that was the class in one sentence, but it was very in depth. I would say the instructor was really cool because they went into so much about um, how media changes the message because it was based on that one phrase by McLuhan. I will say that one phrase is enough for me to know that he is a very important thinker. And I would say every little blurb I've read from fake McLuhan, whatever that Instagram page is, if you want to shout him out, I can't remember his name. But the one McLuhan page that I follow, I will say that I'm always very interested in reading the little blurbs from his writing because he always did have something very interesting to say about how media changes the way we think, and he wrote most of it back before the 70s even, so he was just a very important guy, it seems to me. But I will say what I know about him is very interesting. I would say that his ideas do get you to think more about how you consume things, where you're consuming your literature, how it's making you perform differently as a voter or as a member of society. I'd say that it's um, anyone who makes you think. It doesn't matter how complex the idea itself is or how complex their writing style is. From what I know, McLuhan wasn't an academic writer for most of his career. He would mostly wrote for people in general. And I would say no matter how complex it is, as long as it's something that can get somebody thinking, that's how I identify an important thinker, an important concept.
Mhm. Um, Now your new book, I see the release date is still up in the air, right? Is this a side project for you, a passion project?
It is a passion project. It
Yeah.
is also the first of hopefully many more.
Hmm.
It is I was going to. I keep trying to think. Okay, this next week I'll have it ready. But I'm right now. I'm just still editing through, tossing out a lot of unimportant phrases that I included at first. I think part of learning how to write for me is learning how to be shorter, more concise, and learning when good descriptions are good and when good descriptions are going to make somebody go, okay, come on, get on with it. So
Hmm.
that's where I'm at right now with the process, just going through and eliminating things. And I'm going to try to. I do want to release it by the end of the month.
How far back does the project go? Is it a collection of notes over a few years or just a few months? What is how a few months?
Yeah, actually, October, I came up with the idea. I was like, I've got a lot of good ideas in me. I do want to write a book. Was
Mhm.
in October. And so I started writing down little quips and thoughts that I had and ideas about first lines and monologues and quotes. And I would say a lot of the characters developed on their own once I finally put them on paper, but I would say that a lot of them do start. And this is advice I've heard from people before. Steven Anderson, who writes fantasy, who I've never read his works, he talks about how a great way to come up with a character is to make a rant of theirs or make a monologue of theirs and then use that as your basis for what would this character do in X, Y, and Z. So I would say that it did start with a lot of little fragmented notes about a character that I liked
Mhm.
and or characters I liked. And I would say that once I finally started trying to write a story is when all of that really started to flesh out. And I would say that so far as seeing where the character changes the story and realizing, okay, the story needs to be this way because character A, B, and C are more leaning this way than what I originally anticipated. And so the story is all finished. The concept is all written down. Really, I'm just going back and cleaning it up.
And once it's all done, are you gonna dabble with self-publishing online on Amazon or something? Because you can there. I've seen some books that enjoy some success, even if they're small projects on Amazon. Um,
Mhm. That is what I'm doing. I'm doing
cool.
self-publishing. I
Mhm.
don't have uh, I'm just kind of in between things. I'm about to start a new career here pretty soon, and so I didn't want to make this take any longer than it needed to. I think because I have a lot of access. I don't know a lot of people in the publishing world, and a lot of the help that I found online is a lot of people who really there's a lot of scam artists who will say, we can help bring this book to life. We want 4 figures for it,
Mhm.
like they'll put a number to you and it's like I can't justify that. And so thankfully Amazon's such a wonderful place. And I think I have a lot of wonderful people who follow the page that I made on Instagram that I
Mhm.
trust that whatever success it has will be because of people who really wanted to sit down and enjoy the book. And that's more important to me anyways. I think is that I have friends and family who I know will want to look into it, and if any of them enjoy it, if any of them find something thoughtful and or thought provoking in it, that will matter more to me, I think, than getting it in front of a New York house publisher.
What are you reading right now?
Oh, I just finished the moviegoer, Walker Percy.
Walker
Really good.
Percy.
It's like kind of the tail end of Southern Gothic. I would
Mhm.
call it that. He was very existentialist, read a lot of Kierkegaard and Sartre and places like people like that. And did you ever read the moviegoer in high school or anything like that? There's some
No.
folks who had to read it. I know I didn't have to read it, so I didn't read it until just now, but it's very good. I have been also reading, give me a second, Naked and the Dead by Norman Mailer. First really important World War II novel.
Hmm.
That's another one I've been reading. Kind of going in and out of that one. I probably won't finish it. It's 700 pages, but
Wow.
it has a lot of really great character description. It's got a lot of really great realism. I think that his project was more about realism than it was about storytelling because the story itself, from everything that I've read about it and from what I've kind of been getting from the gist of the book, the point isn't the story, the point is the characters. And so I think that he's a great guy that I've been able to go to get inspiration for how to write well about characters who are faced with very grievous circumstances. Um, but that's something I've been growing in and out of. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier Philip K. Dick, author of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. I finished that in January as well, and I think that that was a very thought-provoking book, and I think it made me realize how much you can put into a book without trying to make the format itself complicated. You can introduce very complicated ideas about things, people, places, history, stuff like that. Um, and so I think that's what inspired me to try to make the story that I'm writing more succinct, more readable, more just let the pages turn about it. Don't try to focus too much on the description while still trying to make it more of a book about history and how we view uh, events in time, events within time, and how we view the way that history becomes history, because history isn't really just the events themselves. I know Heidegger has a rant. I'm not going to remember every way he says it because he speaks in German and it gets translated into really bad English. But Heidegger has a way of explaining that history really isn't just the events that happen. History is an always evolving, affecting, re-affecting element of our lives that makes us choose the way that we live our lives.
I know the quote you're thinking of. It goes, Die Geschichte bingen bangen dann gegangen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, bing and bong and something, something. Yeah, no.
So you mostly read fiction then, it sounds like.
Actually, lately, yes, fiction has been very important just because I'm doing finally a fictional project. A lot of J.D. Salinger, of course, has been a really big impetus for me. I think just how easy, when you read Catcher in the Rye, how much it makes you really grasp that character. You know, it's not first person what I'm doing, but I would say that having started reading things like that back in 2019-ish and been reading more and more good literature has made me really think more about how I would want to present things, again, in that palatable way.
Are you familiar with Leo Strauss's his work on persecution?
No, I'm not.
I think it's called Persecution and the Art of Writing. And he looks at historical persecution and how writers found ways around that through irony, mostly through irony. And the task then for the reader is to read between the lines to a certain extent. If I had to guess, I don't think your work is very ironic. I think it's pretty sincere and I want it to be.
I want it to come across as kind of sincere. Well, at the same time, I want to make sure that nobody reads it and thinks I'm trying to write a biography. Because the main character, I will say, is very, and I think this is pretty common with any fiction that tries to be serious. The main character is a very unsavory person, not somebody who I want people to think I was trying to write about myself. Because and you'll understand if you read if you do end up buying, I hope you do end up buying the book once it's released, but when you're within the first couple of pages, you're going to see why that is, kind of, and then like the rest of the story is explaining from his and another person's perspective, explain not just why he is like that or something like that, but how somebody gets from point A of being very almost self-admittedly not a good person to the point of I can tell myself now with sincerity that I am not a good person. And so that's why the epigraph of the book is actually is from Martin Luther, where he says the beginning of the realization of sin, or the recognition of sin is the beginning of salvation. That's the epigraph. So, but the way that I would say that I tell that story of the epigraph, that little story, the way that I'm telling it is through, I will say, maybe this is fortunate or unfortunate to audiences that will probably be interested in a book that has that as the epigraph. I will say is admittedly a Lacanian sort of Freudian way of telling it, if that makes sense.
What do you mean by that? That's
so Freud's work about dreams. That's what I've read. I've read his book on dreams. I know Freud has a lot of interesting concepts. He has a lot of things that have influenced and not influenced modern, I'd say modern, nowadays modern, recent psychology and psychiatry and stuff like that. But what's more important, I think, to me when it comes to Freud is not just his work on dreams, but his work on what stories mean and how stories always have layers. And that sounds like a very simple thing. I don't think that you need to know Freud to know that, but I think that when you understand what Freud's trying to say, especially in his work about dreams, you realize how important it is when he's trying to describe to you what layers are involved in a story I tell myself, right? And that's why the book is also a prose poem, is because the entirety of the story, you're also getting bits and pieces of this guy's own poetry. And so the story his poetry is telling is very dreamlike, not just because it's the style, but because poetry, much like not poetry, I would say, but autobiographical work, if it is poetic, is going to be somewhat of a dreamlike thing where you're describing things that you won't even know the different levels of meaning that are in it.
That's a
Does that
pretty,
make sense?
yeah, it's an awesome literary device. And did you use your personal dreams at all, or keep a dream journal, or
I will say that the dreams that I tried to come up with in the style of what you would actually expect a dream to be like. So not a
yeah,
future telling dream. Because I think that most dreams that occur in literature, I won't say all of them because I don't have a very broad scope of all literature, especially modern literature. But I will say a lot of times if you read a book and somebody has a dream, the dream gets fulfilled later. This is the one book I think that somebody might read where they'll see the dream later on in the book, and then all of a sudden they'll understand what it means based on that, which is kind of the way that you should look at dreams, I think. And that's not just me or Freud speaking. That's also I think it's Hildegard. Von Hildegard, I think was his name. In the 1800s, there was another guy who was a theologian who was very influential in France, who wrote about dreams just very briefly. And if you've read the first chapter of On Dreams by Freud, he talks about him, which is very interesting. He said, like, one of the only people who's gone into the discussion of dreams to some seriousness in our day and age. One guy, and if you look into him, he's an 1800s very Catholic theologian who talks about how dreams give you an insight to what sin is involved in your life. And while you can't necessarily commit a sin by dreaming, he says, you can actually give an analysis of what is going on with you and what things you're probably struggling with that you didn't know you were struggling with, depending on what kind of dreams you have.
I don't think I found the Frenchman.
Okay.
Maybe Pierre de Chardin. Mm.
Oh no,
I did find Emanuel Swedenborg, Swedish guy who.
Oh no, it's not him. Let me see if I
Yeah.
have the book. If I have it like right here,
Um,
I'm gonna find it maybe. But I don't. I'm not gonna do that to us. But
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I have a good question about dreams and the overall character arc of the protagonist. Right, it's about coming to self-knowledge about sin, and I'm sure there's some moment of revelation, and I'm curious, dreams and revelation, I think though that could be a great literary device. And how exactly, if you don't mind spoiling it a little bit, we call it a teaser,
Yeah,
how does the character experience revelation about himself? Is it through his own introspection? Is it through his own writing? What is it?
I would say it's a little bit of both writing and the one dream that is involved in the book. I will say that it does give it. It's not one of those things where, and he woke up and then he realized, oh, of course I've been a jerk this whole time. That's why I have these problems. It's not like that. But I will say, because I don't want to give away how it's revealed to the reader, but when you do come across that, you'll know you'll know when you get to it. But it's more, the dream itself, I would say, is the pre-confession before the confession, I think. And I think that him relaying the dream, or the way that the dream is related to you, it's a double confession in that you're reading a confession within a confession when you read about that one dream that the guy has. But the dream involves, or the poem itself, I will say, not the dream necessarily, but the poem itself, maybe the dream too. The poem itself does, when it gets to its final draft. I originally wanted to say a poem in several drafts as the subtitle, but I want people to think they were going to buy like 6 pages for a certain price. I thought that would be unfair, or like I didn't want people to think that I was charging an unfair price for a few lines. But the last draft that you do read of that sort of autobiographic poem, by then there's several things that each line will mean by the time you get to the last page of the book. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, there's so much more to this than just a straightforward. And I think that that's what makes dreams a very interesting thing, but also poetry itself a very interesting thing. And like you were saying about reading between the lines, and about, this isn't necessarily irony versus sincerity, but this would be more text versus subtext, right? is you're going to see that not everything can be, and it's almost impossible to find at least an interesting piece of writing, and really probably any piece of writing that's going to only have a single set meaning, which is also why biblical literature, and I think anybody who has studied an amount of theology is going to understand what I'm saying. I'm not trying to be a postmodern liberal when I say this.
I was about to ask you.
Yes, no, but I will say that the Bible, if you read the Bible and you really, especially I would say if you are a prayerful person, I know many people in my life who are very prayerful people. I will say that I wish I could be one of them. I'm not as prayerful as many wonderful men that I know in my life, but the men that I know in my life who are very prayerful men and who love the Lord and who read the Bible as a source, not just of analysis, but of devotional, will tell you that there are always going to be, you're going to read, this is the line you'll probably get from anyone who's which will tell you this is a person who has really tread deeply in these waters. They'll tell you every time I read it, I learned something new, or I'll see something I didn't see before. That's just their way of telling you that there are layers to it.
Mm-hmm.
Which
I wanted to ask about, obviously there's some experimental literary devices, which is very cool, very interesting. And I wanted to try to tie it back to postmodernism. Of course, we've mentioned some of that, but I don't think, I think you probably have mixed feelings about postmodernism as this kind of catch-all concept, right? So are there elements of that, or is it just kind of not?
So in the book itself, I would say that because I am unfortunately a product, I think all of us can say we're all products of postmodernism, in that we live our lives in a postmodern landscape. And I think if I ever wanted to explain to somebody what postmodernism is from everything that I have read about it, because I have read, unfortunately, Foucault and Heidegger and some other really important, wonderful people, some of them wonderful, some of them not, people who have had a lot to say about what postmodernism is. First thing I would say is postmodernism does not mean a viewpoint. I would say that postmodernism first means the landscape that you are already in. I would say that there are people, I want to say that the guy who wrote actually the first thing about postmodernism in the 60s, not Laurel, what's his name? It was an L name, Lyotard. Lyotard did talk about him, I think, being a postmodernist, but I would say that postmodernism is just the landscape that I live in. I happen to be a 25-ish year old man who lives in post 2000s America. I live in a landscape that has been created and mulled over and chewed on by what happened after modernism, because post just means after, right? So we live in an age where modernism is just so left behind. It's so hard to really consider everything. Let me think of the tenets of modernism real quick. We were talking about the Enlightenment earlier.
You mentioned about 1500, that's when modernism roughly begins. And before we go off on that, let's put a catch on where it ends. I think you could make a decent case that postmodernism becomes explicable on September 11th, right?
Oh, I was going to say 1955 or something like that, or the bomb.
But maybe
I might even say 1945 after the first bomb drop. That's being a little more,
I think.
But no, I think that I would say within American society and within what you're talking about within the landscape itself, I would say that September 11th I think is one of the probably either number one or number two probably dates that somebody would give. I can't really give a date. I would just say maybe around the 60s or so, whenever you have the cultural explosion, the hippies, and whenever you have, I feel like I'm gonna get torn up by somebody who actually reads this stuff a lot more than I do for my choice in grabbing this. But I would say a lot of it has to do with advertising. This is where postmodernism begins.
And once we get our devastating critique online, I think we'll just delete our accounts and we'll never go on the internet again, right?
Exactly. Surrender to the CIA.
Yeah, I agree.
Sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
No,
it's
I would
all
say September 11th is a good guesstimate. I think for where you've completely left off the modern
cross the
period.
Rubicon, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, absolutely. That's a
Hmm.
good. I think that's a good date for it.
Yeah. Um, so we're at about like an hour and 2 minutes, I think.
Okay.
So why don't we leave it at that? Go check out Hank's website, hankrosen.onuniverse.com. About when are you looking for a full release? Sometime in late February, early March?
Yeah, hopefully late February. Yeah.
Hmm.
But I'll announce it. I'll announce it to. I'll put it on the website, and I'll also put it on my Instagram and everything else. Let people know,
Hmm.
give people a heads up, just to know that it's about to be out there. And I'm just hoping that a lot of folks are able to enjoy it for what it's worth. That it's a
Hmm.
good story. That it is, that's I think the number one thing that I want to focus on. Is just allowing this to be something people get to enjoy.
Hmm. Well, sounds great. I can't wait to read it myself.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right,
All right.
guys, we'll leave it at that. And
Great. Thank you so
yeah,
much for having me.
thanks. You too. Have a great day.
You too. All right.
Bye
Bye.
bye.